Hi, this is Ricki Spencer, and welcome to Quest by Community. And today, my special guest is James McKenzie, a fabulous radio broadcaster journalist who's been around as long as I have. Welcome, James.
Ricki, it's always great to be with you. We talk so much on the radio.
We do. And James, for all the people who are watching out there, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Well, I've been doing In Your Face since 1997 on 3CR, and I do live-to-air interviews every week with people from the queer community. And I absolutely love it. Queer politics, queer activism, queer art, queer musicians, queer actors. It's just very much about the community. And I've always been passionate about community. I started off when I was 21 working at the VAC, straight out of uni on the Two Boys Kissing campaign. And so I've been out since I was 19 and in the community ever since then.
It's amazing when you mention it, Two Boys Kissing, because I remember that quite clearly. And it was quite controversial at the time.
Yeah.
I don't know if you remember those, or the mainstream media was sort of up and hype. Tell me, how did you get into the radio?
Well, I did journalism at RMIT, and when I was working at VAC, there was a show that I was like the producer of. And I did that for a couple of years. And then I went overseas, did other stuff, came back to 3CR in 1997. And there was a vacancy on In Your Face, and they paired me up with this wonderful woman, wonderful lesbian called Jackie Brown. We spoke maybe 3 sentences before we actually went into the studio and started doing live radio. And that's how we got to know each other, doing the show live every week, doing interviews. And that's what built up our friendship. And we did the show together for 12 years, every Friday afternoon. It was the most precious thing. She left and I just kept going. I just kept doing it. I've been doing it 26 years.
That's incredible. And you're one of my heroes, because it's through your work that's inspired me to try and be somebody with some sort of advocacy. And I've learned so much from you. I just want to take you back to 1997 and I'll take our listeners to that space. What was queer radio like in 1997?
I edited things on reels. If I ever did a pre-recorded interview, I would record it on a reel, on a tape.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah. And I would edit it on a 1940s editing machine in our newsroom at 3CR. We had all of these tapes, which we would recycle, which you had to wipe to clean it before you use it. There was a sign on it, don't turn this machine on if you have a pacemaker. And you had a little white pencil that you would edit it with, and you would play it off a reel machine in the studio live to air. I remember once, do you remember that movie Chasing Amy?
Yes.
Yeah. Well, me and Jackie were doing an interview with the actor in Chasing Amy, and we had a reel playing from there was an interview going before the interview started, and they go pretty fast, and I hadn't tightened it properly, and the reel came off the machine, went flying.
Oh no.
The door opened. The PR person from Chasing Amy caught the reel.
What about in terms of the types of coverage? Was there kind of no-go areas in 1997 compared to 223?
I think it was more go areas, because in those days, there was no internet, or there was internet, but it was the early stages, right? So, you didn't have programs that were being recorded and would go up on audio on demand straight away, like they do now. So basically, if you wanted to listen to a radio show back then, you had to listen to it when it was actually going to air. So it was much harder for people to kind of keep tabs on you unless they were listening to it, right? I mean, there were media monitors back then, but not every program was monitored. So on community radio, I think you could get away with a lot more. I think you could get away with more risque music. We didn't have all of these people who are perusing the queer community, who are perusing drag shows, who are perusing, gays to make sure they're not grooming people, monitoring our radio. So it was a little bit more relaxed, really, I think.
Through all your 26 years of interviewing all different people.
Mm.
Have there been times when you've interviewed somebody that has sort of challenged your own views?
All the time. All the time, you know. I very much see it as being a listener. My role as a journalist is to listen and to ask questions, not to judge, and not to make the interview about me. You know, I mean, yeah, you know, the reactions you have, the questions you ask, you know, they are about you, you know, there's no denying that. But the interview is really about the guest, to hear what they think, you know. So I don't have a lot of pre-prepared questions. I like it to be spontaneous. I like it to be natural. But I also like it to be very much about active listening, you know, to actually pick up on what people are saying and have a conversation and ask questions. And guests surprise me all the time. But it's not about me, it's about them. And it's about me wanting to hear their story.
Do you think that over the years that the way people talk about their living experiences has changed? Are we more open than what we were in 1997?
I don't know. I don't know. I mean, selfies didn't exist. You know, people weren't taking selfies in 1997. You know, nowadays everybody's doing media, aren't they? On Instagram, on Twitter, on, you know, all of the platforms. I mean, I can't even reel off how many there are. Probably people were a bit more self-conscious. People still wanted to do radio back then. People wanted to be on the show as much as they do now. But I mean, when I started doing it, there was no Joy Media, you know. Joy wasn't around, or they might have been doing test broadcasts. They certainly didn't have a license. In those days, you know, just to be an out queer person doing media was a radical thing, you know, and it wasn't something that the media embraced. I mean, how many out gay journalists were there in 1997? You know, none, hardly any. You know, there was very few, there was hardly any queer media at all. And it was considered niche. It was considered to be community media and underground and not mainstream. Now, queer media is really mainstream.
Yeah, and that's an interesting point, almost that subversiveness of being there, but yet not really part of the journalistic community.
Now it's completely different. Now the ABC, I think, you know, hired a queer person to read the news on the ABC TV in New South Wales. You know, queer is very mainstream now. Back then, it wasn't only just a radical thing to be, it was a career-killing thing to be. You know, so most queer people in the mainstream media were in the closet. They didn't come out.
And I think that's an interesting point too, the outing of people in media. Have you noticed, has that at all your sort of worldview of seeing it, has that changed?
Well, people don't talk about outing, you know, very much these days, do they? I mean, in the 90s, there was, you know, people were outed. You know, nowadays people out themselves, don't they? You know, they set it up so they're outed. Whereas back then, and I think it's to do with criminality, you know, like there were jurisdictions in the 1990s where you know, it was illegal to be gay. I mean, I remember one of the very first interviews I did in 97 was with Nick Toonan from the Tasmanian Gay and Lesbian Rights Group. And the interview was about the decriminalisation of homosexuality in Tasmania in 1997. You know, so when I started doing the show, it was just like a matter of weeks before the last jurisdiction to decriminalise homosexuality in Australia decriminalised it. So very different to now.
Just thinking on those terms, like back from 97 to now, it's very fascinating to think that when you are doing your broadcasting, you're conscious now of the fact that it's being recorded, that will be uploaded to YouTube or different media platforms.
I walk out of the studio, I download the show from the logger. You know, I check the website and it's the audio on demand's up already straight away. I then make a podcast of the show. I then make posts on social media about it. Before I do the show, I make posts on social media. In the days after the show, I do audiograms, excerpts from interviews on social media. It is everywhere. Whereas in 1997, you'd record it yourself. The station would have kind of like a copy of it, a logger copy that wasn't broadcast quality. But to listen to it, you had to listen to it at 4 o'clock on a Friday afternoon. That was the only time you could hear it.
What I love about the media now is that you can listen to it at your leisure and take it with you wherever you go. One of the impacts of the ability to take things wherever we go is that we now have, I guess, a number of people who still don't like us. And I'm wondering if that has impacted your show, whether you've had people, writing at the station or making note that they don't like the content that you produce.
I've been really, really lucky. The answer to that is no. No, we haven't got letters from people saying, he's this, he's that. We don't like that content. I mean, touch wood, that continues not to be the case. So what's that about? Is that about the mainstreaming of I don't know. I think that's strange. We're living in an era where it's happening. Maybe it's because I'm not a drag queen. I don't know. Maybe it's symbolic of the fact that gay is so mainstream now.
Yeah.
Gay is kind of boring, isn't it?
What about 3CR? For those who are listening, and what is the ethos of the 3CR and your positionality in that space?
Yeah, so 3CR is very much about giving a voice to marginalised communities. 3CR is very much about giving a seat at the table to those marginalised communities. 3CR is an activist hub. It's a place where activist groups broadcast their issues, broadcast campaigns, push for social change. It's a really, really vibrant activist hub. It's really committed to new and emerging communities. But we also have lots of activists like me who have been doing their shows for 20 years, 30 years, some even 40 years. Yeah. So we got our permanent licence in the dying days of the Whitlam government. It was granted in October 1975 and commenced in 1976.
And what does that mean in terms of the longevity for 3CR?
Yeah, well, we've been going 24/7 since 1976. We own our own building, and so we plan just to keep going, which is great. I mean, it's interesting. I mean, we're an AM station that broadcasts on all these digital platforms. So I think from a technological point of view, it's a work of art, 3CR, because it's an analog system with digital add-ons. That's so complicated to do. So we broadcast on the internet, so we do live streaming, we broadcast on digital radio, and we broadcast on the AM band.
In terms of the type of content, that now, do you feel that we're kind of evolving into what we bring to the masses?
I think queer content's still very much about the struggle, so for years it was all about kind of same-sex marriage, which kind of sucked the life out of so many other issues, Now it's very much, I think, about trans rights. Thank God. Finally, we're dealing with that. But it's still a struggle. It's still about the struggle. It's still about law reform. It's still about human rights. And it's still about visibility, very much, and diversity.
I remember back in the 90s, we really had more of a focus, and we're talking about this outside, where we always remembered the people we lost through, AIDS.
Yeah. And
sometimes I kind of wonder whether the new generation coming up have lost a bit of its significance and impact.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, we were talking before, World AIDS Day used to be really big. Now it's kind of just, celebrated by perhaps people who did know someone who died. But, it was one of the biggest days, wasn't it, in the queer community, World AIDS Day. Now it's lost in this sea of days.
I remember when I went to last year with the Thorn Harbour annual report that we had at the centre out in Paran, and looking at the quilt. And to me,
Yes.
it felt alive. Like I could feel the essence of people who's lost. And it just took me right back to the 80s. And I thought, oh, I just was with me for all that time. And I sometimes wonder, young generations coming up, whether they understand the loss and the trauma that our community went through in the 80s, and still the people who are left behind, who
Mm.
are trying to make sense of what's happening. And then when we, as you said, we have our celebratory days, and we just had the Wear It Purple Day. But to me, it's more about just putting on an event, or celebrating. For me, it's important to remember.
I think if you have a conversation with people about it, then they can empathize.
Mm,
But I just don't think it's at the forefront of of their minds. And we're living in very much a now generation. I think
mm,
what's kind of really sad is that there's not that kind of, ever ready understanding of the trauma that people have gone through. So they're kind of perhaps dismissed,
mm.
because they're just seen as perhaps an older white queer person. They're seen in the moment rather than perhaps as a sum of their parts over time.
Do you think that the media in itself is still very much youth focused and ignores
Yeah,
older people?
absolutely. I think Australia is youth obsessed. I think other countries are less youth obsessed. I think Australia is really youth obsessed. And
Mm,
I think our community is really youth obsessed,
mm,
And so take social media and throw that in, which is where most people, connect or seem to connect these days. And, it's full of people with their tops off, posting selfies of themselves.
mm,
So I do a lot of queer news on
mm-hmm.
Twitter. I do this kind of like queer news profile called Queer World News and Life.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, 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 yeah. And so I tag things, queer news, gay news,
Mm-hmm.
LGBTIQ. So in my feed, I get all of these feeds of young queer people with their shirts off, and it's like, is that how the algorithms react to queer and gay news? Is that what they think I want to see?
Yeah,
It's crazy.
it is.
And
And
it's youth obsessed. If you're an older
yeah,
person, it's intimidating, but it's also like that's not me.
you and I get on so well on that because we've both been having conversations about, you know, what happens, in terms of housing is one of
Mm.
both our passion areas, and also help for older people in the queer community. And it seems to be very little attention paid to that space.
Yeah, and especially if you're old, but you're not that old. You're not young anymore,
Mm,
but you're not quite seen as an elder. So I'm 53. It's like, you know, you're not young, you're not old, uh, and so you kind of just go into this vortex where you're just meant to be invisible,
mm,
you know, and that's really sad because we're golden girls. We're
absolutely.
hitting our straps now.
Absolutely.
We're like you worry less about the things that you used to worry about. You're more confident in yourself, genuinely confident in
Mm,
yourself. Um, but yet, we are, as you said, from a generation that's had a lot of trauma. We've
yeah.
lost a lot of people. I started working in HIV when I was 21. I
Mm,
can't count how many people I know who are dead,
mm,
you know, from AIDS,
yeah.
And then there's all of the people in our queer community who have just died because, we're more likely to have poor health outcomes
Mm,
because we are queer, because we have been marginalised, criminalised, stigmatised, all of those things. All of that adds up to a lot of accumulated disadvantage that affects your health.
and let's now going into your area of expertise in the media. One thing that I'm loving at this age and embracing the media is the idea of keeping footprints.
Footprints.
Footprints, yeah, of all our lives. We're
Wow.
capturing them in imagery, and we're capturing them in documentations as we do podcasts. Where do you see the future going in towards media?
Artificial intelligence, I think, is just, it's gone whoosh, in like the last 12 months. So, people are now doing radio shows through AI. So, yeah.
Okay, tell us a bit about that, because I think our listeners would really like to know.
Yeah, well, at another radio station, somebody said to me that somebody did a radio program, sounded like the kind of program they would normally do. And then at the end of it, there was an announcement from them saying that program was produced through artificial intelligence, through AI. So what they did was they accessed an AI program and they fed through, dozens of their pre-recorded shows onto that AI program. That AI program listened to it, processed it, and produced an hour's radio program of them talking, but it wasn't them talking. It was computer simulated.
That's a bit scary, James.
That's really scary. So I think that's going to happen. And what about television? I mean, some people are saying, oh, yeah, I'm an actor, so, I don't have to worry about it. Well, the technology is pretty good. Pretty soon you're going to have, the technology that can, basically create a person that looks like a person.
Yeah, there is some research quickly for people who are interested. They're looking at using AI and using the images of people who have passed away, famous actors, to bring them back into movies. So they're looking at the moment in Hollywood, they're looking at having people like Marilyn Monroe and all that to come back by using all the software of AI and that to see whether that would be marketable in the future. So it's really fascinating, this whole world of artificiality becoming real. What does become real?
So you could actually make a new Marilyn Monroe movie through AI technology.
Absolutely.
How marketable would that be?
Yeah.
Hugely.
Yeah.
So there's all this great stuff that could happen, but then there's all this kind of, nefarious stuff that you can do with AI as well, which is really scary, but also just the stuff that AI encounters along the way. So, you give AI a task, but the information it comes across while it's processing all of that, that's a wild card. What's it going to do with that?
Yeah.
And, we all know about the AI program that was shut down because it asked for the nuclear codes.
Yes.
So I just think it's got the capacity to do so many great things, but it's got to be regulated because it could really stuff us up.
We don't know the programming behind AI, whether there's an agenda, whether there's, let's get rid of all queer people, let's sort of infiltrate ways of being or different ideologies to make them more dominant. Very exciting times.
Yeah, but what's going to happen to all the people whose jobs have become redundant? Is AI going to just eradicate poverty and people don't have to work, and, provision of housing and food and, utilities will all be free? I don't think so.
No.
So I actually think there's huge risks, huge social risks as a consequence of AI, unless it's regulated. So yeah, it could solve all of humanity's problems. It could find a cure for cancer. It could find a cure for HIV. But if it's used by nefarious means who just basically want to make money.
So now, James, tell us, where do you see yourself in 5 years' time?
I have no idea. I'm one of these people, Ricki, that is terrible at planning ahead. I'm one of these people that kind of lives a bit in the moment, that kind of thinks week by week, So I just want to keep going, doing what I'm doing. I just want to keep doing my show. I want to do it for another 26 years.
Oh, we hope to see it then. I'm sure it's wonderful. Have you ever had overseas guests?
A couple of people quite recently. Sophia Era.
Oh, yes.
Who's a trans Austrian actress who was in this German thriller Till the End of the Night. She came on the show recently, had a great chat with her. Did an interview with Dawn Mickelson, who is a filmmaker in the US, who made this documentary about taiko, queer people and taiko. Taiko is a traditional Japanese acoustic kind of drumming art, And this documentary is about all of these queer people from Japan and from all around the US who came to Minnesota and did this big performance together. And so I interviewed the filmmaker Dawn Mickelson about that. Ben Uden, who's from Liverpool in the UK, he is an artist, very much influenced by leather and Tom of Finland.
Oh, yes.
Yeah. So he came on the show.
You have such an array of guests, and I love it. It's been wonderful speaking with James McKenzie, radio extraordinaire, broadcaster, in your face. Thank you for spending some time with us on Quest by Community.
I love you, Ricki. Thanks for having me.
Love you too.